women have remained the most historically marginalised group within the bleeding disorders community. Despite reporting symptoms similar to their male family members with bleeding disorders, women and girls have been routinely ignored. Through projects such as this one, we aim to preserve the voices of these women, ensuring these voices are consistently heard. And through the continued education of the public and medical professionals, we aim to create for women real parity and equality in diagnosis, treatment and care. So tell me again about your first visit to a healthcare professional and what happened.
The very first was when I had my nose cauterized as a child, but nothing ever was suggested about hemophilia or bleeding disorders or anything. They just said that it was dryness in my nose. So fast forward through many bruises and bleeding episodes throughout my life where I was just told that it was normal. That's what happened in our family. I had quite a number of children. And after my very first, I was 22 and went into shock. And I was scared. I didn't know what was happening. And then I had the second one, the same thing happened. And we inquired, why am I going into shock? And they said, oh, it's just from the blood loss. And I asked, if the blood loss was so severe, why weren't they doing anything about it?
And, when was the first time you had a visit to the healthcare professional and how did that go?
It was during my pubescent years. My mother took me to the doctor to see what was going on because the menorrhagia was horrible. The pain was terrible. The passing of extreme clots with my menses was terrible. And the bruising was significant, bled on and through my clothing. And so as it progressed and got worse and worse, Mom took me to a physician. We shared my story, and that was unusual for us right there because, Mom taught us that, if you have an illness, a sickness, or a weakness, that type of information you kept in the home because you didn't want people to make unkind judgments about you or there be some type of stigma. So we were taught to, what happens in the home stays in the home, to learn and to deal, but we had to reach out because we were desperate, and suffering in silence was not the answer.
They also would come in and stuff my nose with gauze. And as soon as they removed that gauze, it would gush. And I can remember them telling me I wasn't allowed to cry, because if I cried, it would remove the clots. And so I can remember the little me standing at the window at the hospital looking out as my mother was leaving and trying very hard not to cry. Eventually, what stopped that bleeding was a woman intern who took a long object with silver nitrate and cauterized the area that was bleeding. But in the meantime, being malnutrited and very sick, all of my pictures as a child, I looked like a waif with round shoulders and very pale because I was anemic. They didn't know what was wrong with me. Years later, I got my medical reports from that hospital experience. And in the report, they said there is hemophilia in this family. However, this cannot be because she is a woman. Therefore, it must be a vitamin K deficiency, which of course it was not.
I was diagnosed 2.5 years ago. I was at a meeting in a conference, and I was actually sitting next to the nurse for my HTC. And it was a meeting about women with bleeding disorders. And they had this list of 10 things on the board that you could qualify as a woman with a bleeding disorder if you could check off 3 of the 10 things. I checked off all 10. And I was going, I got that. And the nurse next to me said, I'm really interested in doing a women's clinic. I think you're our first candidate.
Okay. I just wonder whether you could give us an overview of your experience and when you were diagnosed. That would be great. Thank you.
Well, I'm turning 60 this November, and unfortunately, I didn't get a diagnosis until I was 56 years old. I actually didn't know that I had hemophilia, that I was a carrier of the gene until I had my second son. And when he was circumcised, he wouldn't stop bleeding. And he was then diagnosed with severe hemophilia. It took me, he's 27 years old now. So it took me all that time to receive a diagnosis for myself.
And what had happened beforehand, in your experience, that made you feel that you did have a bleeding disorder?
Well, growing up, I used to always have to go to the emergency room. Weekly, my parents would take me at least 2 or 3 times a week, and they would have to cauterize my nose because it would bleed so much. And I remember that they would take this cloth and put it in boiling hot water, and then they would shove it up my nose to stop the bleeding. And after a while, it just became regular. And it's interesting because, you don't really think anything's wrong with you because they don't ask you questions. They don't diagnose you. You just keep going back and going back, and they keep repeating the same thing to make the bleeding stop. And like I said, after Matthew was born, then I realized, wait a second, when I had him, I had a C-section. And they couldn't stop me from bleeding. They literally had to turn me upside down to keep the blood inside of me until they could figure out what to give me to stop my bleeding. And at that point, when Matthew was then diagnosed with hemophilia, I thought to myself, you know what? I bet you that I have hemophilia. This all makes sense now. All the bleeding that I had, all the bruising. When the boys, I have 2 sons, and when they were growing up, they were very active in sports. If I had my period during a time that they had a game, I couldn't even go to their games because I would be afraid that I would have an accident and I'd have to come home and change.
What happened when you first visited a healthcare professional?
Well, the interesting thing is that I went to a treatment center in the state that I live in California. I went with a friend of mine, and I had been diagnosed by my son's hematologist prior to this visit. And that hematologist happened to retire from the hospital. So I went back in for an annual visit. And when I went in, they actually looked at me and said to me, we're sorry, but, you don't have a bleeding disorder. And I'm like, wait a second, I was diagnosed with a bleeding disorder. And they were like, well, that doctor no longer works here, and we have to go off what our results show. And our results show that you don't have a bleeding disorder. So after that, I advocated for myself, and through different resources and groups that I belong to, I heard that there was a doctor in the state of Nevada that treated women with bleeding disorders. So I made an appointment, went up for a visit, and got my diagnosis up there.
So thank you for joining us, Dr. Sidonio. I just want to ask you why it's taken so long for women to receive a bleeding disorder diagnosis, and how we can move forward and make things better for women going forward.
Yeah, I think there's a long gap between, the start of bleeding symptoms, recognition by the woman or girl that the symptoms are abnormal or outside of what's considered normal, and then actually getting to the physicians and providers. And then, of course, there's the gap on our end in which we able to recognize what's normal versus abnormal and what kind of workup we need to do. So unfortunately, that often is, quite a long period of time.
What do you think women should do in the medical profession to ensure that takes place?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that women and girls could do to help us as providers be able to get them to get the diagnosis if it is something ultimately that they have. I think objective documentation of the bleeding symptoms is very helpful. So having pictures, so it's very easy to say, well, I had a couple of bruises here and there. And then when you show the bruises in unusual locations, very large, multiple groups of them, those pictures are much more powerful than the descriptions. Documentation, how often they're happening, for example, nosebleeds, whether they are accompanied by iron deficiency anemia, So, and there are objective tools that are available to women and girls. They're called bleeding scores. There are a number available online in which you can ask the questions of yourself and self-complete them. There's something called the ISTH self-BAT. And, having that documentation, knowing when those bleeding symptoms occurred, and having some pictorial evidence of it is really helpful for us as providers. It allows us to really get a sense of what's going on, and hopefully subsequently order the right laboratory tests.
Thank you for your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks.